brave souls, to the haunting tale of Eileen Marlow, a woman who dared to confront the darkness lurking within her family's cursed estate. As you follow Eileen's journey through shadows, secrets, and a final, fateful sacrifice, prepare yourself for a story where terror and courage collide. If you're ready to face the unknown, be sure to subscribe for more tales that chill the spine and stir the soul. Now, step into the shadows with us, if you dare. Eileen Marlow had always been a woman of words. As a successful novelist, she had built her career on the delicate interplay between reality and fiction, drawing readers into worlds of mystery and intrigue. But now, as she stood in front of the old Victorian house that she had inexplicably inherited, Eileen felt an unsettling mix of curiosity and dread. The once proud home, with its ivy-clad walls and Gothic spires, seemed to loom over her like a forgotten relic of a past she had no knowledge of. The letter from the attorney had arrived a few weeks earlier, informing her of the unexpected inheritance. A distant relative, one she had never heard of, had left her the house and all its contents. The timing had been almost eerily perfect. Eileen, reeling from the recent loss of a close family member and struggling with a deepening sense of writer's block, had been desperate for a change. Perhaps, she thought, this house could offer her the fresh start she needed. The decision to move in had been impulsive, driven more by a desire to escape her current life than by any real attachment to the property. But now, as she stood before the imposing structure, Eileen couldn't shake the feeling that the house was more than just an inheritance. It was a challenge, or perhaps a trap. Her best friend, Karen Blackwell, had been there from the beginning, offering support and encouragement. "It's a new adventure, Eileen," Karen had said with her usual optimism. "A chance to clear your mind and find your inspiration again." Karen had insisted on visiting Eileen on her first day in the new house, bringing with her a housewarming gift, a small potted cactus. "For strength and resilience," Karen had said with a smile as she handed it to Eileen. Eileen had placed the cactus on the windowsill in the kitchen, appreciating the thoughtfulness behind the gesture. But as the days passed, Eileen began to feel a growing unease. The house was old, creaking with the weight of centuries, and every shadow seemed to move just out of the corner of her eye. She tried to brush off the sensation as nerves or the effects of the isolation, but the feeling persisted. Then came the first letter. It had appeared one morning in the old brass mailbox by the front door. The envelope was yellowed with age, and the handwriting on the front was spidery and old-fashioned. Eileen hesitated before opening it, her heart pounding in her chest. The message inside was short and cryptic. Beware of what is close to you. Eileen stared at the words, a chill running down her spine. She glanced around the house, half expecting something to leap out at her. But there was nothing, just the empty rooms and the silence. She tried to dismiss the letter as some sort of prank, perhaps left behind by a previous owner or a neighborhood kid. But the unease gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. Karen visited the next day, as she often did, bringing a cheerful energy that Eileen desperately needed. Eileen showed her the letter, hoping Karen would laugh it off. But instead, Karen's face grew serious. This is weird, Eileen. Really weird. Maybe it's just some old letter that got mixed up with the others, but... Karen trailed off, her brow furrowing in concern. They decided to keep an eye out for anything unusual. But as the days passed, Eileen found herself unable to shake the feeling that the house was watching her, waiting for something. And then the second letter arrived. This time, Eileen found it on the kitchen table when she woke up one morning. She was certain she hadn't left it there the night before. Her hands trembled as she opened it, dread pooling in her stomach. The past is following you. Seek forgiveness. Eileen's mind raced. What past? Whose forgiveness? The words seemed to burrow into her thoughts, unsettling her even further. When Karen came by later that day, Eileen showed her the letter, her voice shaking. Karen's eyes widened as she read it, her expression darkening. Eileen, this isn't just a coincidence. Someone's messing with you. Maybe it's time we looked into this place's history. Together, they began to dig through the old house, searching for clues. They started in the attic, a dusty, forgotten space filled with old trunks and faded memories. It was there that Karen found the first of the documents. Old letters, journals, and official papers tied together with brittle string. As they carefully sifted through the papers, a story began to emerge. A story of a family named Marlow, who had lived in the house for generations. Eileen discovered that she was a descendant of this family, a connection she had never known existed. The more they uncovered, the more the pieces began to fit together, and the more Eileen's unease grew. But it was Karen who found the most disturbing piece of all, a journal belonging to a man named Edward Marlow, Eileen's ancestor. The entries were filled with references to dark rituals and a mysterious entity referred to only as the Shadow. As Karen read the entries aloud, Eileen felt a cold dread settle in her chest. The Shadow, according to Edward, was a force he had summoned in his pursuit of power and immortality. But it had grown grown beyond his control, a malevolent presence that haunted the house and sought to complete the ritual that had been left unfinished. Eileen and Karen exchanged uneasy glances. The letters, the sense of being watched, the shadow, all of it was connected. But the question remained: what did the shadow want from Eileen? That night, as Eileen lay in bed, unable to sleep, she heard a faint, rustling sound. She sat up, her heart racing, and listened. The sound was coming from the hallway outside her bedroom. Gathering her courage, Eileen crept to the door and slowly opened it. The hallway was dark. The only light coming from the moon filtering through the window at the far end. She took a step forward, and the rustling sound stopped. Eileen's breath caught in her throat as she saw it. A dark shape at the end of the hallway. Almost human, but not quite. It was as if the shadows themselves had come to life, forming a figure that stood silently, watching her. She froze, her mind racing. The shadow. It was here, and it was real. But before she could react, the figure melted into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Eileen stood there, trembling, for what felt like an eternity before finally retreating to her room and locking the door behind her. As she lay in bed, her thoughts spinning, one thing became clear. Whatever was happening in this house, it was far from over. The morning after her encounter with the shadow, Eileen awoke feeling drained, her mind still haunted by the vision she had seen in the hallway. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the potted cactus Karen had given her. The small, resilient plant seemed so out of place in this house of darkness and secrets. Karen arrived later that day, her usual cheerfulness dampened by the worry that now seemed to follow both women like a cloud. Eileen recounted the events of the previous night, her voice shaky as she described the shadowy figure in the hallway. Karen listened intently, her eyes wide with concern. Eileen, this is getting out of hand. We need to figure out what this thing wants and how to stop it. They decided to return to the attic, hoping to uncover more about the house's dark history and the shadow that seemed to haunt it. As they sifted through the remaining documents, they found more references to the rituals Edward Marlow had performed. Rituals designed to bind the shadow to the house and the Marlow bloodline. One document in particular caught Karen's eye. It was a letter written by Edward Marlow to his brother, filled with regret and fear. Edward had realized too late that the shadow was a force he could not control. In his quest for immortality, he had unwittingly bound the shadow to his descendants, dooming them to a life of torment and fear. have unleashed a darkness upon our family, a curse that will not be easily broken, Edward had written. The shadow seeks to complete what I have started, to consume the souls of those who bear the Marlow name. If you are reading this, know that I am sorry for what I have done. May God have mercy on us all. Karen put the letter down, her hands trembling. Eileen, this isn't just about you. This thing is tied to your family, to your bloodline. It's been waiting all this time for someone like you to come back to this house. Eileen felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. But why now? Why is it coming after me? Karen shook her head. I don't know, but I think it's trying to finish what Edward started. Maybe it needs something from you. Something to finally free itself, or gain more power. As they continued to search, Eileen found a set of old keys hidden in a small wooden box. One of the keys was labeled Cellar. Eileen and Karen exchanged a look. Neither of them had explored the cellar yet. Determined to uncover whatever secrets lay beneath the house, they made their way to the cellar door. The stairs creaked ominously as they descended into the darkness, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. Eileen used her phone's flashlight to illuminate the space, revealing dusty shelves lined with old bottles and jars. In the far corner of the cellar, they found a large, heavy chest. Eileen's hands shook as she inserted the key and turned it. The chest creaked open, revealing more documents, along with a small, ornate box that seemed out of place among the dusty papers. Eileen lifted the box carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she found a collection of strange, hand-carved symbols and a small, leather-bound journal. The symbols seemed to pulse with a faint, dark energy, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The journal belonged to Edward Marlow. As Eileen and Karen read through the pages, they uncovered the true extent of Edward's obsession. He had become consumed by his desire for power, conducting dark rituals that involved blood sacrifices and the invocation of malevolent spirits. The final entries in the journal were frantic, almost illegible. Edward wrote of how the shadow had grown too powerful, how it had begun to take on a life of its own. He feared that the shadow would one day consume his descendants, feeding on their fear and despair until it could break free from the house entirely. The shadow is no longer under my control, Edward had written in the last entry. It seeks more than I can give it, more than I can comprehend. It waits, hungry and patient, for the right moment to strike. I fear for those who come after me, for they will bear the weight of my sins. Eileen Eileen and Karen exchanged glances, their fear palpable. They had found the source of the curse, but they still didn't know how to stop it. And with each passing day, the shadow's presence in the house seemed to grow stronger, its influence more pervasive. That night, as Eileen lay in bed, she heard the now familiar rustling outside her door. Her heart pounded as she listened, her breath catching in her throat. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right outside her bedroom. Summoning all her courage, Eileen threw open the door, only to be met with darkness. But this time, she saw something new, scratch marks on the floor, leading from her bedroom to the stairs, as if something had been dragged. Terrified, Eileen followed the marks down the stairs, her mind racing. When she reached the bottom, she found Karen standing in the hallway, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Eileen, I saw it," Karen stammered. "I saw the shadow. It was here, in my room. It tried to... I don't know what it was trying to do, but I could feel it trying to get inside my head." Eileen's blood ran cold. The shadow was no longer content with lurking in the corners of the house. It was actively trying to manipulate them, to take control. They both knew they couldn't stay in the house any longer, but leaving wasn't an option either. The shadow was tied to Eileen, to her very bloodline. It would follow her wherever she went, growing stronger with each passing day. Desperate, Eileen and Karen returned to the cellar, hoping to find something, anything that could help them. As they pored over the documents and symbols, Karen began to piece together a possible solution. "The shadow is bound to this house, but it needs a sacrifice to break free completely," Karen said, her voice trembling. "If it can consume the soul of the last Marlo, it might be able to leave the house and take on a physical form." Eileen's heart sank. "So, it wants me." Karen nodded. "But maybe there's a way to trap it here, to destroy it before it can break free. But it would require..." Karen trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. Eileen knew what she was about to say, and the weight of it settled over her like a shroud. "It would require a sacrifice," Eileen finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen nodded, unable to meet Eileen's eyes. "But if we can destroy the shadow, we can end this curse. For good." Eileen stared at the ornate box in her hands, feeling the dark energy emanating from the symbols within. She knew what had to be done, but the thought of it filled her with dread. The next morning, Karen was gone. Eileen woke to find the house eerily quiet, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. She called out for Karen, but there was no answer. Panic set in as she searched the house, every corner, every room. But Karen was nowhere to be found. Finally, Eileen noticed something on the windowsill in the kitchen. The small cactus Karen had given her as a housewarming gift. Something about it seemed different. And when Eileen looked closer, she saw a piece of paper sticking out from the soil. With trembling hands, Eileen pulled out the paper and unfolded it. It was a letter from Karen, hastily written and filled with fear. Eileen, if you're reading this, then the shadow has already taken me. I don't know how much time I have left, but I can feel it pulling me towards the river. I tried to fight it, but it's too strong. I'm so sorry. If you don't hear from me, please look for me by the water. Forgive me for leaving you like this. Please, be strong. Eileen's hands shook as she read the letter, her heart breaking. Karen had been her closest friend, her confidant, and now the shadow had taken her. The weight of it all pressed down on Eileen's chest, making it hard to breathe. With a sense of grim determination, Eileen grabbed her coat and headed out to the river, following the path that Karen had taken. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape, and Eileen felt the chill of fear seep into her bones. When she reached the riverbank, she saw it, Karen's body, lying still and lifeless on the cold, wet ground. Eileen fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she cradled her friend's body. Beside Karen, half buried in the mud, was the leather-bound journal from the cellar. Eileen picked it up, her hands trembling as she opened it to the last entry. The shadow is close. It wants to finish what Edward started. It needs my blood, my soul, to break free. But if I can destroy the symbols, maybe I can stop it. If you're reading this, Eileen, know that I tried. Please, forgive me. End this. End the curse. Burn it all. Eileen stared at the words, feeling the weight of Karen's sacrifice. Her friend had given everything to try and stop the shadow, but it hadn't been enough. The burden now fell to Eileen, and she knew what she had to do. Eileen stood frozen by the riverbank, Karen's lifeless body cradled in her arms, the reality of her friend's death sinking in like a cold, crushing wave. The journal, clutched tightly in her hand, felt like a final plea, a desperate last attempt to end the darkness that had consumed so many lives. She couldn't let Karen's death be in vain. There had to be a way to destroy the shadow, to finally put an end to the Marlo Curse. But as she looked down at Karen's still form, Eileen felt a deep, gnawing fear begin to take hold. The shadow had taken Karen, her only ally in this nightmare, leaving Eileen truly alone. The weight of the task ahead felt impossible. How could she, a writer who had never faced anything more terrifying than a looming deadline, possibly stand against a malevolent force that had haunted her family for generations? Eileen knew she couldn't stay by the river. She had to return to the house to confront whatever remained there. She had to honor Karen's last wishes, to find the strength within herself, to end the curse once and for all. With great effort, she laid Karen's body gently on the ground, whispering a final goodbye before she forced herself to stand. The walk back to the house was agonizing. The fading daylight cast long, eerie shadows across the path, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made Eileen flinch. The shadow was close. She could feel it. It was as if the air itself had grown heavier, charged with the malevolent energy of the entity that lurked within the house. When she finally reached the front door, Eileen hesitated. The house loomed before her, dark and silent, like a living thing waiting to devour her. But she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior of the house was bathed in shadows. The once familiar rooms now twisted and strange in the dim light. Eileen's footsteps echoed hollowly on the wooden floorboards as she made her way through the house, clutching the journal to her chest like a lifeline. Every corner seemed to hold a new threat. Every creak and groan of the house, a reminder that she was no longer safe. The shadow was everywhere and nowhere at once, watching her, waiting for the moment to strike. As she ascended the stairs to the attic, the air grew colder, thicker, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The attic door stood ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out into the dark hallway. Eileen paused at the threshold, gathering her courage before she pushed the door open. The attic was exactly as she had left it. But now it felt different, oppressive, malevolent. The dusty old furniture, the piles of forgotten belongings, all seemed to be watching her, as if the very essence of the shadow had seeped into every corner of the room. Eileen set the journal down on an old wooden table, her hands shaking as she flipped through the pages. Karen had marked several passages, underlining them in red ink. They were all connected to the symbols and rituals Edward Marlow had used to bind the shadow to the house. One passage in particular caught Eileen's eye, a detailed description of the final ritual Edward had intended to perform, a ritual that required the blood of a Marlow to fully unleash the shadow's power. But Karen had scrawled a note in the margin. Destroy the symbols. Burn the house. End it. Eileen's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what she had to do. The symbols that Edward had carved into the wooden beams of the attic, the markings that bound the shadow to the house, they had to be destroyed. And then the house itself had to be burned to the ground. With trembling hands, Eileen grabbed an old, rusted crowbar from the corner of the attic and approached the first symbol, a dark, twisted carving etched deep into the wood. She hesitated for only a moment before she brought the crowbar down, splintering the wood with a satisfying crack. The house seemed to shudder in response. A low groan emanating from the walls, as if the very structure were in pain. Eileen didn't stop. She moved from beam to beam, destroying each symbol with a ferocity she hadn't known she possessed. The shadow recoiled with each blow, its presence retreating into the dark corners of the attic, hissing and writhing like a wounded beast. But the work was far from over. As the last symbol was obliterated, the shadow surged forward, a mass of darkness that filled the room, howling in fury. Eileen stumbled back, the crowbar slipping from her hands as the shadow loomed over her, its form twisting and writhing in the air. "You cannot destroy me," the shadow hissed, its voice echoing through the attic. "I am bound to your bloodline. As long as you live, I will endure." Eileen's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. "Then I'll end it. I'll end all of it." The shadow recoiled, sensing her resolve. "You would sacrifice yourself? For what? To deny me? You cannot escape what you are." Eileen felt a cold clarity settle over her. "This ends with me." She grabbed the journal and the remaining documents, piling them on the wooden table. With shaking hands, she pulled a box of matches from her pocket, striking one with a trembling thumb. The flame flickered in the dark, a tiny beacon of hope against the encroaching darkness. The shadow howled in rage, surging forward as Eileen dropped the match onto the pile of papers. The fire caught quickly, the flames licking hungrily at the dry, brittle pages. Eileen watched as the fire spread, engulfing the table and the symbols that bound the shadow to the house. The shadow writhed in agony, its form dissipating as the flames consumed everything in their path. The attic filled with thick, acrid smoke, and Eileen coughed as she backed away, the heat of the fire scorching her skin. But she didn't run. She couldn't. The house had to be destroyed completely, and that meant staying until the end. Eileen descended the stairs, the fire spreading rapidly through the old wooden structure. The walls groaned and splintered as the flames devoured them, the house shaking as if it were alive, struggling against its imminent destruction. Eileen made her way to the center of the house, the heat unbearable, the smoke choking. She could barely see, her vision blurred by the tears and the smoke. But she had one last task to complete. The shadow might be bound to the house, but it was also bound to her, and she had to ensure that it could never escape. She reached the front hall, where the fire had yet to reach. The small potted cactus, the last remnant of Karen's hope, sat untouched on the windowsill. Eileen took it in her hands, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make. As the flames roared around her, Eileen placed the cactus on the floor and knelt beside it. She whispered a silent apology to Karen, to the generations of Marlo who had suffered before her. Then, with one final act of defiance, she overturned the pot, burying the cactus under the rubble of the house. The fire consumed the last of the house, the walls collapsing in on themselves as Eileen remained kneeling, waiting for the inevitable. The shadow's screams echoed through the burning remains, growing weaker with each passing moment. Finally, with a deafening roar, the house collapsed entirely, burying Eileen and the shadow within its smoldering ruins. The flames licked at the sky, consuming everything, leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. And with the death of Eileen Marlow, the curse of the shadow was broken. The bloodline was extinguished, the house destroyed, and the darkness that had plagued the Marlow family for generations was finally laid to rest. Far away, in a quiet cemetery at the edge of town, a new grave marker had been placed. Its inscription simple and unadorned: Eileen Marlow, 1982 to 2024. She faced the darkness and set us free. No one knew who had placed the marker there, but it was clear that Eileen's sacrifice had not gone unnoticed. The grave was tended with care, a small bouquet of fresh flowers placed beside it every week. It became a place of quiet reflection for those who knew the story, a place to honor the memory of a woman who had given everything to end a nightmare. The townspeople spoke of Eileen in hushed tones, with a mixture of sadness and reverence. They knew that she had not only saved herself, but had also freed them all from the shadow that had haunted the town for so long. Her bravery had broken the curse, and for that, they would be forever grateful. The Marlow estate, now nothing more than a burned-out shell, was left untouched. Nature slowly began to reclaim the land, wildflowers growing where the house once stood, the ruins gradually sinking into the earth. The townspeople avoided the site out of respect and perhaps a lingering sense of unease, but there was no longer any fear. The shadow was gone, its power broken, and the land could finally rest. As the years passed, the story of Eileen Marlow and the shadow of the Marlow house became something of a local legend. It was told and retold, each time with new embellishments and details, but the core of the story remained the same. A tale of darkness, sacrifice, and ultimately redemption. And in the end, that's how Eileen would be remembered, not as a victim of the shadow, but as the hero who had faced it down, who had chosen to sacrifice herself to save others. Her story became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a way to break free from the past. The Marlow bloodline ended with Eileen, but her legacy lived on, a beacon of light in a town that had once been shrouded in darkness. End of the story.